Hello, good afternoon. My name is Patricia, and today is our Lunch and Learn from Family Partners of Maurice and Sussex. Today we have a special guest. Her name is Susan Gibbs. Susan in her bio, and there is a lot of information there. So Susan, please go ahead and welcome.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Okay,
Yes.
great. So Patricia, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here again. I was part of Lunch and Learn in October, I think, on school refusal. So I'm very excited to be back. Thank you so much for having me. And as Patricia stated, I do have more than 18 years of experience. I've been in community mental health as a bachelor's and getting my master's degree, and also doing my postgraduate work, my practicum hours, my hours for my clinical licensure and things like that. So all through the children's system of care. So I've worked with adults in case management. I've worked in adult residential. I've worked in children's residential as the therapist for 9 adolescent boys. That was a really, really great learning experience. And I hope that the children benefited as well. It was very awkward at first though, because they had me in a basement office with no windows, and I was meeting with like 9 adolescent boys. Like it was I was like, where's the panic button? Like, because I'm 5 feet tall and the boys are like, 5.5, 6 feet, 6'3". So yeah, so we had groups and we had individual counseling, we had parent and family counseling as well. I also did IIC work, so intensive in community, on and off for 10 years. I was in an alternative high school. I was a program coordinator in an alternative high school for 4 years, and also the coordinator for Burlington County Children's Mobile Response for 3.5 years. So like in terms of like understanding like children's mobile response and the timelines they're under, and being a certified mental health screener, working in a screening center, case management as a psych rehabilitation coordinator, and also, as an IIC, as a licensed clinician, both in home and now currently doing private practice. So I've seen our children and the families that we work with in all of their environments, right? Like at their very worst in crisis, in their homes, in their natural environments, in the school setting, and at outpatient. So I feel very privileged to be here, and I really appreciate you guys having me here today. So Patricia did bring up a good point about questions. So this is a really small group, so I really like to be able to answer questions and just make it relevant for the people who are present, right? And yes, so YouTube will be a larger audience, but hopefully people will tune in with if they have specific questions answered too, because if 1 or 2 or 3 families have those questions, then we know that even more people have the same questions. And I want to be able to answer those. I do have a slide presentation prepared if we want to use that as a jumping off point. So I guess just let me know if you ladies have any burning questions, things that you really hear all the time, and anything that I can make note of, and maybe I can just skip ahead to that slide for us.
Does anybody has any question? Okay. I think as we go, go ahead, Jim.
No, go ahead.
No, I was saying that I think as we go, we're probably gonna have some questions, because we know when we're talking about ADHD and ADD, we're gonna have a lot of questions. So probably as you start the presentation and we start learning about everything about that, we're gonna have a lot of questions for sure.
Sure. And I think I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. So you
guys hear me?
I hear you when you say, can you hear me?
Okay. What about now? Okay. So based on the information that you provided, it seems to me like most likely, if ADHD is not treated, we can see children having some challenges at school, because obviously, for a child to perform well at school might have to follow with a structure and everything. So is that safe to say that, or?
It is safe to say that. And so, a lot of times we won't diagnose ADHD, or it won't come to a parent's attention until they're in school. right? And that's where a lot of, you know, like the boys will be boys all of a sudden isn't boys will be boys anymore, because they're in school, they're not following directions, they're up and out of their seat all the time, you know, they're interrupting other kids, they're interfering with other children's learning, and interfering with their own learning. And so that's when it becomes problematic, and when all of a sudden it becomes, you know, the hyperactivity and the impulsivity become problematic way before the inattentive type becomes problematic. So we see so many boys being diagnosed in elementary school, and then girls telling their parents that, like, I just can't focus, it's really hard to concentrate, you know, in middle school and in high school, and their parents are like, just stop being lazy, just put your phone down, just, you know, stop talking to your friends, just focus a little bit more, get better sleep at night, you know. So there's all these like myths around you know, ADHD, and like it's just diagnosed twice as many times. I've seen research that says like it's 9 times as frequent in boys as it is in girls. But you know, the research that the myth that I have says, you know, it's at least diagnosed twice as much for boys as it is for girls, because we just say that the girl is being lazy, or that the girl, you know, because they got such great grades in elementary school, because it wasn't identified in elementary school, because for a girl it was most likely inattention and not hyperactivity. So girls are getting overlooked, and you know, they get into, you know, middle school and high school, and now it's getting more difficult to learn, and the parents, you know, inadvertently are just kind of making them feel bad about themselves, because it's like, well, stop being lazy, or just put your phone down, right? Because it's just not as obvious for girls or for the inattentive type of ADHD as it is for boys. Even the boys who will be straight A students, and then all of a sudden get to 9th grade and they're just like, I just am having trouble focusing. And the parents are like, well, you just have to go to bed earlier, right? As if, you know, and sleep fixes a lot of things. I'm the first proponent of, you know, what's like when somebody comes into my office, what does the sleep schedule look like? What is sleep hygiene, right? Like I'm the first person to ask about those things. But you know, I'm also, you know, me myself personally, and I know this is going on YouTube, but me myself personally, not being diagnosed with ADHD until the age of 42, like for years, like it was just like, oh, well, I'm just procrastinating, you know what I mean? Or like, oh, I'm just like have trouble getting motivated, like, and not and because I was able to get straight A's in high school, nobody recognized that it was ADHD, right? Until everything starts falling apart. So you know, so I'm a huge proponent of you know, early diagnosis for girls, you know, for the inattentive part, and like, you know, getting parents on board with helping them before it really affects their self-esteem. And then, you know, we see the, you know, the intense anxiety and you know, self-doubt and low self-esteem and low self-worth, you know, and that leads to depression and things like that, you know, in high school. So sorry, I got off on a little bit of a tangent, but
no, it's great information. It's definitely great information. Thank you.
yeah. So moving on.
I have a question. Are like sensory issues, like almost like feeling of clothing, or is that attributed to ADHD?
Not,
Or, like,
that's a great
overeating?
question. Do you say overeating?
That's another question. Yeah.
Overeating could be attributed to the impulse control, right? Like they just are not like able to stop themselves. They know they need to stop, you know, so, but there's also like this very biological connection between the brain and the gut, right? So so that could be making themselves feel, there's so many things that have to do with overeating and impulsivity. You know, I tend to think of that not so much as ADHD, though, as more of like maybe possibly an underlying mood or anxiety disorder with overeating. And then the sensory issues, it just could be that need for stimulation, right? But like if it's like the child who's like doesn't like the seam on the sock, or the child who needs like the sweater to fit a certain way, or the collar can't be this, or I can't, you know, have my food touching each other, that's more going to be more of like a sensory processing disorder and less about an inattentive, like an inattentive or hyperactivity disorder. Not that those two things don't co-occur, right? So we see a lot of children like on the autism spectrum with ADHD at the same time. So
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
I have
You're
a
welcome.
quick question too.
Sure, Shauna.
Why would it be more noticeable in a girl than a boy?
I'm sorry, it's more noticeable in a boy than in a girl in elementary school.
Oh, because the girls are always daydreaming. Okay, got it.
So the girls are daydreaming, or the girls are talking, right? So like I was saying, like there are definitely signs and symptoms that I see in my own daughter. Like I said, like it took me until I was in my 40s to get diagnosed with ADHD. I'd love to be able to have her diagnosed with ADHD at an earlier age if it's clinically indicated and if it's necessary for school, right? So right now she talks excessively. She just never ever stops. She's super creative, super intelligent, straight A student, has lots of friends. So right now I don't necessarily see the need to intervene on the ADHD. Like she'll ask me a question and and she's terrible at following through on directions. But in school, she can turn it on, right? Like she knows in school. But there's a lot of reasons she doesn't want to go to school. Why doesn't she want to go to school? Because it's exhausting to like have to pay attention and have to like focus that hard for that long. Like it's just exhausting. And she's very, very tired and she wants nothing to do with anybody the second she comes home from school. And so it's usually 20 minutes to an hour before anybody can talk to her because she's exhausted from having to pay attention all day. Because it's just not in her to do that. So what we've decided as parents is, there's an anxiety disorder and there's ADHD. So for right now, because she's 10 and she's still growing and she's already a little bit shorter, we're addressing the anxiety so that she's sleeping, so that she worries less. So she eats regularly, so we're addressing the anxiety component with her. And like I said, if in high school it gets to be necessary for her to be medicated for the ADHD, then of course we would help her with that at that time. And then my youngest, maybe she's got ADHD and maybe she doesn't, but that kid is the most disorganized kid I've ever met. Sweetest child.
You haven't been to my house.
Completely disorganized.
I've not been over here.
So, and I'm not ready to do anything about, diagnosing her with ADHD or not with ADHD because it's also learned, right? She's learned to be disorganized from her mom. So I can't, I'm not going to blame that or pin that on my child or treat my child for that yet until I notice that, it's interfering with her schoolwork. So right now I'm just paying attention. Can you finish your assignments? Do you feel like you have enough time? Do you feel like you need more time? So just, being educated on what it could look like in girls and keeping an eye on it, keeping a pulse on it and checking in with the teachers.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
Would the ADD or ADHD make like a 10-year-old girl more susceptible to, I don't want to say following the crowd, but more susceptible to giving into peer pressure or whatnot? And
absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Because they're more easily led, they're more easily influenced by other children, because of the inattention or because of hyperactivity, or they're not sequencing and not thinking about what comes next, right? So they're definitely going to be more susceptible to doing what their peers are doing because they want to be accepted, because they don't want to be rejected, and because there's this really little known affiliation with ADHD that I feel like we see more in girls than we do with boys, but it affects both of them equally. Is this very, very new, and I've just learned about this year, this thing called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So, and it's very obvious when they get their devices, right? Like this overwhelming reaction, these reactions, these ideas of like, the sensitivity to rejection or perceived rejection, and their whole entire world falling apart, and like these overreactions to these very little things. Like somebody said something, somebody didn't like my TikTok, right? Somebody didn't, somebody unfollowed me on Tumblr. Well, that was just one person. Well, if one person unfollowed me on Tumblr, then they're going to go to school and they're going to tell everybody else not to follow me because they didn't like when I posted blah, 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 right? Or, somebody left me unread for, okay, somebody left you unread for how long? Somebody left me unread for 2 hours. Okay, maybe they were a practice. No, they weren't a practice. They just decided that they don't like me anymore because so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that, and now it's gotten to them and they don't, so it's these overreactions and over dramatizations, right? And it can look like a severe mood disorder when it's just like these intense reactions to rejection or perceived rejection. They can actually feel a physical pain. It actually feels emotionally like pain. And so I don't want to say all girls with ADHD have it, or all kids, that have like, this perceived rejection or who follow the crowd absolutely 100% have ADHD. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is it's important to ask these questions and do the full assessments and understand these little things about ADHD that we didn't know before, in terms of helping our young students and helping our adolescents make better decisions and helping them have the support that they need.
So I'm just going to go a little further with this. So say, so it seems like they would perceive something as something small as being much bigger, and maybe it like magnify it a billion times in their head. And, and it necessarily wasn't that, but it automatically, it just becomes something so much bigger because it hurts them inside, because it really is emotionally tasking, right?
Yes.
So there's something almost like they almost see something as like an explosion, when really it was just I don't know, a piece of a pencil, their favorite pencil fell on the floor at this one time where they were just stressed out or whatnot, right? Having a bad day in front of their friends.
Right. So this so I think a lot of times like we would use like intermittent explosive disorder, when really it's not intermittent explosive disorder. It's, for a child who has ADHD, who perceives things and perceives rejection very intensely, that yes, the reaction to something very, very small, the reaction is going to be much, much bigger and disproportionate. We would say like an emotionally disproportionate reaction.
Okay, so they would view it much differently than it really is. Okay.
Yes.
And then, so here's my question, because I for about a year, when my daughter, it was COVID season, of course, and I had been pushing and pushing and pushing because I noticed all these things going on, and I noticed that she was suffering from the same things as I was with the ADHD symptoms when I was a kid. And the biggest thing, that was one of the biggest arguments, was no, we don't want to label her. And I said, look, I don't think it's really a label anymore. So, I just want her to get the help that she needs, right? And nobody wanted to do that. So how do I fight the system so that, they really do, take this serious? Because I did speak to the superintendent, and, and then they ended up getting the, oh goodness, what is it called? I call it the jury, but it's not, the team.
Child study team.
Yes.
Yes.
But it was like, it's like pulling teeth, it really is. But, I sit there and I'm just like, well, she's exhibiting this, this and this. And it's just one of those things. And, a lot, the teachers, they're like, oh, she's just not paying attention, or, oh, she's not. And I'm like, no, she's trying. I know she's trying. Like, I know, so I don't know how to.
Yes. So I love that, when you talk about like your child having inattention, right? And like, I like inattentive, ADHD is like definitely like an actual diagnosis. And they're like, no, she doesn't have ADHD. She's just not paying attention. And you're like, yeah, that's like a huge contradiction, right? So, so when the school, like you have rights as a parent. So as CMO can help, FSO is extremely helpful with that. SPAN is helpful with that, but your child has rights. And so you write a letter and you draft a letter and you make sure that it gets to, to get to the child study team. And they have up to 60 days to respond to that letter, and so they, for a child that they don't think needs to be classified, they will take all 60 days to answer that, right? So you as a parent, while yes, we want the school to do things, there are resources outside of the school, right? So you're up in North Jersey. So like I said, like, I'm not sure, like I know Dr. Amon has a clinic. I'm sure he doesn't take insurance though. So there needs to be something like a CHOP or, like a Neuroabilities up north that does take insurance, where you can get the brain scans, where you can get like the full battery of assessments done to make sure, that she gets diagnosed, and you take that to the school and you say, okay, you guys took 60 days to say yes or no, she can have a 504 or not have a 504. Well, I have an evaluation, you guys, and the school board has a psychologist, like and a psychiatrist that has to review the documentation that you would bring, whether or not they want to. They do have people on staff or consultants that had to review it. If they decide that like a 504 won't be granted, there's an appeal process, and when you have all the supporting documentation, they have to abide by that.
Okay, and then is there like a template that's, because I know that when I was fighting the insurance, this is many moons ago when I was pregnant, actually, the insurance company had denied me of getting a new night guard, right? And I was pregnant and they like refused. So someone gave me like this template for this, and the correct, there was keywords I had to use, right? And the insurance immediately decided to, when I gave them that letter, they were like, okay, yeah, no, we're not denying you care, blah, blah, blah. I forget what words I used, but it was
right.
Words.
Yeah, you can. I mean, of course you can Google it. I would go on SPAN. SPAN. I'm sure that SPAN, SPAN as in Nancy. So that's a network for parents for advocating for children's rights and educational rights. And they would have a template or something close to a template. Sure. But some of the FSOs, like I don't know about up north, but I know some of I know the Burlington County FSO, further south, they do, like the FSO will help them. They have a standing meeting in a library where they help parents with the 504s and the IEPs.
Thank you so much.
And Jennifer, thank you so much for your question. And since we have, I know that we're almost running out of time, and we had the honor of having you today here, and there is a lot of information, out there. I just have a last question, because I think it's so important for families to identify the difference between ADHD and ADD, because a lot of people get confused. And since you're talking about ADHD, and we have the honor to have you today, so do you think it's possible that you can just clarify a little bit in relation to ADD and ADHD, since there is a big difference between the two?
Sure. So ADD and ADHD. So like I said in the beginning, because that you brought that up too in the beginning. So ADD is attention deficit disorder. It's kind of like an older term, right? So there will be people who older, like doctors who got their degrees, or psychologists who got their degrees, before 2006, who will use the term ADD, because those were the terms used earlier. Just like when we say, we might say currently bipolar disorder, but every once in a while you'll come across people who say manic depressive, right? Because before the term bipolar disorder was used widely, it was known as manic depressive in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So it's kind of the same thing with ADD and ADHD. So doctors will say ADD if they're talking about just a deficit in attention, right? And they'll use ADHD if a child is very hyperactive, runs on a motor and is hyperactive and impulsive, when really if somebody comes to my office, I'm not going to differentiate ADD or ADHD because my schooling is newer. And so I'm just going to say the child has ADHD across the board. And I'll let the parents know primarily inattentive or primarily hyperactive.
Okay, that's good.
Right.
That's good that you clarify that, because I have seen information, actually articles in relation to ADD and ADHD, that they just point out the part of hyperactivity, the difference between the two, and that's good that you clarified that, because that's great information that we need to know for sure. All right. Does anybody has any question? I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions probably right now, since it was a lot of information out there. Definitely, Susan, thank you very much. It's an honor, definitely, having you here. And I know a lot of families are going to benefit from all this information. And Susan, if a person or a family want to reach out to you, how do they can reach out to you?
Sure. So in the slides, I put my email. I'll put my email here too in the chat too. Everybody has it. And like I said,
going over all this information, but yes, that would be great. All right, if any more questions, or we good? You guys stay on the line if it's possible.
mhm.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for everything. Have a
Thank
good
you,
night.
Jennifer, for coming.
Thank you.